Well, for more on the country's economy and future, we're joined by Raymond Zucaro, Chief Investment Officer from RVX Asset Management, live from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you again for having me on.
So as we heard there, Venezuela is juggling a number of economic issues. Some are calling it a crisis. How would you describe the economic situation in Venezuela?
Frankly, the economic situation in Venezuela is actually very bad. You mentioned an inflation rate of 180%. Estimates run as low as 300 to as high as 700 with the IMF. You're in your third year of severe economic contraction. This year to date, a 10% GDP contraction. Venezuela is really in a hard spot right now. They have a heavy amortization later next month and then the first part of next year that they're trying to deal with. Frankly, they don't have the money to pay it. They are in a very difficult situation right now.
And as you mentioned, you have this very wide range of estimates about the situation there. So what does the Venezuelan government then say about this crisis? Or do they think that the media is overblowing it, perhaps?
They don't really consider it a crisis. They call it an economic war that the U.S. is inflicting upon them. They try to, typical leftist government, they blame others. They are not willing to admit the mistakes of their own economic policies that have put them in this situation. They blame the U.S. and blame other countries.
Now, one of those policies, obviously the result of this rising inflation, we're seeing more and more reports of people abroad sending food to Venezuela. What's the government's take on that?
The government's very silent on that. And you touched on one of the most important issues, food, and more importantly, medicine. People are dying. The death rate in Venezuela has spiked up because people don't have access to medicine. You're having a real humanitarian crisis because of the government's policy and the government restriction on hard currency. It is a true problem.
Now, in the midst of all this, we also know that Venezuela is hosting this weekend's Non-Aligned Movement Summit. So from their perspective, in terms of the goals, what would a successful outcome look like for them?
With the issues going on in Venezuela today, they're more concerned about this recall referendum, and they would like the biggest issue of importance right now for the Venezuelan government is to have no issues, no protests with this summit of non-aligned nations. They've been very quiet on the recall referendum. There's a strong movement to try to have early presidential elections to remove President Maduro from power. So for what would be an ideal situation for Venezuela is to have no protests and no incidents ahead of the summit.
Now, one of the things we've obviously seen them struggle with, Venezuela is home to one of the world's largest oil reserves, but its economy has tanked largely due to these falling commodity prices. Do you think this will be an opportunity to perhaps push for curbing global oil production in order to get those prices back up?
Venezuela has been one of the most adamant countries about cutting production, but Venezuela's issues are really self-laid. Venezuela has, as you mentioned, one of the world's, if not the world's largest oil reserve. They have wonderful climate, great opportunities for tourism, metals, mining, gold, pretty much you name it, Venezuela has it. It's the economic mismanagement. And yes, they are suffering now because oil prices went for the Venezuelan basket from 100 to about 40 today because they overspent, they overlevered, and they didn't save for the rainy day.
So with Venezuela having to put out so many different kinds of fires, if they had to wave a magic wand and really tend to one first, really get the ball rolling and really get the economy back on track, where do you think they should focus?
Really, at the end of the day, Venezuela is an exporting nation. So what you've seen is not only you've seen a fall in the commodity price, you've seen a lowering in production. If you look at other oil-producing nations, Saudi Arabia and Russia come to mind, while oil prices have fallen, they've increased production. So production times price equals revenue to the country. Venezuela has the double whammy of lower prices and lower production. If I were to wave the magic wand for Venezuela, fix the production issue.
And lastly, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay recently stripped Venezuela of the rotating presidency of Mercosur, that's the South American Regional Trading Bloc. Yes. Does Venezuela risk isolating itself regionally?
Very much so. You've seen a very strong resistance or push away from the left-leaning South American leaders. You've seen presidential changes in Argentina and Brazil. And Venezuela is, really was at the forefront and is really one of the few left-leaning countries out there. So in terms of isolation, repression on the opposition, abuse against reporters, and isolation from a political side, Venezuela is really, floating off to an island by itself.
Well, definitely something we'll be keeping an eye on. Thank you so much for joining us, Raymond Zucaro from
Thank you for having
RVX
me.
Asset Management.